Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our Q4 Manufacturing Outlook webinar today. I'm Richard Austin, BDO's Head of Manufacturing. 2024 has been another year of interesting and major change across the UK and more generally across the world, which has clearly impacted manufacturers amongst other sectors as well. Everything from economic shifts, changes in political leadership, um, everything through to dynamic changes in terms of trading and other challenging challenges coming across as well. As we approach the year end, so we're Q4 now, we're delighted to be joined by James Brougham, Senior Economist at Make UK. James is going to provide an update on where we are, the state of the UK manufacturing situation, and share some insights from our latest Make UK and BDO Manufacturing Outlook report, which launched yesterday. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. Christmas is coming. It'll be interesting to see whether James has got anything under the tree for us this time. Following James's update, we're going to have a panel discussion, which is going to focus on supply chains, which is particularly relevant for this time of year as well. With our panel, we are delighted to have Matthew Clark, who's a partner at BDO's Customs and Excise and International Trade Services team, and also Fraser Paget, our man of trucks and sheds. So he's our head of supply chain and logistics at BDO as well. What we'll be doing then is basically discussing the key challenges that manufacturers have faced in the year and also look forward to 2025. Clearly, with a customs and excise person, understanding supply chains and the tax implications of any changes from the budget, I'm sure will come up during that conversation. After that, we'll be having a live Q&A. So as usual, I think there's some functionality at the bottom of your screen. Please do hit the Q&A button and we will pick those up at the end of the session. With that, I will hand over to James. James, I'll leave it to you to bring in our Christmas wishes and looking forward to the new year. What have you got for us, James?
Thank you very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could be, a gift giver this Christmas. Unfortunately, as those of you that have, perhaps had the misfortune of hearing my slight pessimism in the past, unfortunately, I can't really turn a corner meaningfully on that. However, what's very interesting here is despite the metrics ending up at the end of the year roughly where we expect them to end up, there's been a sort of pedestrian, there has been a little bit of boom in output. The real focus of this quarter, and excuse the sort of optimism in my voice because it's not particularly optimistic, but what it is a major shift, is a shift in confidence. And so we had a serious downturn in confidence, and I think this is the major takeaway and the major finding in this quarter's edition. And we'll see that more, and it'll be illustrated very clearly when we get to that slide. But to start with, what I'll do is I'll go over some of those key headlines, and then we'll interrogate some of those metrics one by one. So if I could have the next slide, please. So as I hinted at the start, actually, output has bounced up a little bit. We weren't expecting this because we didn't have demand there last quarter. Demand's been relatively weak, and it's weak again this quarter. So we're not particularly hopeful that next quarter that we'll see demand, excuse me, that we'll see demand, that we'll see output continue to grow because the fundamental demand isn't there to drive it. But where there has been demand, and this is the second bullet point, and I want to temper this second bullet point, where there has been demand, indeed over the past couple of quarters, it's been driven by exports, not by the domestic market. But before, I encourage you to hold your horses before you think that's a significant scale or particularly large story, because the total level of demand has been very weak. So it's, 2/3 of nothing has been, exports, but it's not, you'll see that in the next slide in a moment, hasn't been driven by overall, the level hasn't been driven particularly high. Price setting behavior. This is a major one and a major proprietary piece of data in Manufacturing Outlook. We're watching it with a wary eye. Suggestions are that prices will continue to rise at a greater rate next quarter. But given the change in how the sector is perceiving its future forward expectations, which we'll talk about in a moment, there's slightly less, a bit more pinch of salt with those future expectations. Employment is consistent. We're moving slowly towards the long run average in terms of vacancy rates, and slightly investment intentions do remain stable and positive. But they're not particularly large, and that's a problem in and of itself, and I'll explain why. The major point here is confidence dipped sharply. It says there for UK economic conditions, but it dips sharply across both concerns. And really what this is the first dip in confidence that we've seen for the first time in over a year and a half. So quite interesting there. But fundamentally overall, if we look at this bottom bullet point, 2024 minus 0.2%. If you've got a really good memory, you might recall throughout the year. So this is the final forecast of the year for 2024. It's been at around 0.4, 0.6. I think earlier on in the year, it might have peaked at about 0.7, 0.8. But the point being is it hasn't changed that much. And even though unfortunately at the end of the year it's ended up with just slight negative figure in front of it, it still was only ever moving around within 1 percentage point. What's always been more important is the 2025 forecast, and that's at 0.7, and that's been quite diminutive throughout the entire year. So even at the very start of 2024, analysts have been able to be confident that 2025 isn't looking like a major growth year, and that's actually more concerning than rounding off 2024 with a slight and minus 0.2%. So for argument's sake, that's flat, and I wouldn't want to encourage the negative connotations that are associated with using the word, contraction or receding. So if I could have the next slide, please, and we'll go through some of these metrics. Now, output and orders, as I mentioned. So just as a quick health warning, as I always like to do, with all these charts I'm about to show you, where you see a bar and percentage on the left-hand side, these don't represent absolute proportions. So if in a given quarter, if it says 20% in output, 20% in orders, it does not represent in a given quarter that output or orders increase by 20%. What this represents is the balance of industries, their balance figures, suggesting that 20% greater proportion of the sector saw an increase in output that quarter or orders or whatever it might be, than those that did not. And this allows us to get fast-moving trends about where the sector is going. Now, if we draw our attention to the far right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's that red bar for output has jumped up relative to the previous quarters. We actually saw in 2023 Q4, again, at the same time last year, the similar sort of Christmas activity boom, except unfortunately it's not accompanied by a particularly commensurate orange bar, which represent orders, which is, again, effectively a proxy for demand. Now, when we look at that, if you look at Q1 and Q2, we actually get far more excited at that sort of relationship between output and orders, even though the scale's lower, because we see the orange bar slightly ahead of the red bar, and then subsequently the red bar, then that those orders filter through into output in whether it's the next quarter or the coming quarters, and then if we're lucky, we see demand grow, and it's a sort of healthy progression. Why, even though it's been the highest output figure for the year over the past 4 quarters, which is a great short-term boom for those that deliver products in that time, it's not accompanied by that boost in demand. So we can't necessarily be very confident about there being extra demand in the system that's going to meet itself out in Q1 and Q2. So if we can have the next slide, please, and we'll look at where the breakdown of these orders. Now, what you're looking at here is effectively that orders metric on the previous slide, but then broken down into its component parts, UK orders and export orders. Now, if we look at the far right and just to the left of the green box bar, and I'll get to that green box bar in just a second, you see the orange bar, you can barely see a red bar. If you have a magnifying glass, there's a slither of it there. And so effectively this quarter is that, the UK market has been flat, and where there has been any growth in demand, it's come from export orders. That's what the sector is suggesting. Last quarter, you might remark that actually the domestic orders moved into contractionary territory and export orders were, carrying the torch there again. And such was the case in Q2 as well. But I just want to temper caution about coming to strong conclusions about this, because the total level of order or demand activity is still quite low. So yes, it's quite interesting that it's the export orders that are propping it up, but coming to because this might invite you to come to conclusions such as that exports are exploding, which they're not. It's just where the small demand is, it is coming from exports. Now, what we see here is our first bit of evidence around that lack of confidence. So I mentioned confidence, and of course, we'll see in a couple of slides' time, we have our dedicated confidence metric. But also confidence can be, understood through the future 3-month intention that we undertake as part of this work. So where you see on the far right, the green box bar where it says next 3 months, that's not our forecast. That's an aggregation of the industry's view about where they think any given metric might be for their business in 3 months' time. So in this case, Q1 of 2025. Now, what's particularly interesting here is that for the past 4 quarters, 5 even, the sector's been exceptionally confident. So that effectively, that green box bar has been ginormous for each quarter subsequently. But actually, when we get to the next quarter, that performance that isn't realized. So the sector's been confident in a sense, sort of suggesting that, well, it's right around the corner. We're having a boom right around the corner, and it hasn't manifested yet this year. But now those expectations are really sobered up, and we're not seeing really, huge bars in those green boxes anymore. So that accompanies the downturn in confidence, but also means that has the sector sobered up in its expectations, or has it given up on the idea that, a bit of a run on economic activity is happening around the corner? So that's interesting. Just bear that in mind as we go through some of the next slides. So if we have the next slide, please. And to illustrate some of this, what this is a marrying up of those expectations for output and orders, which are represented by the bars, and then what actually happened in that quarter, which is represented by the dots. And now, if we draw attention to the far right and look at the penultimate 3 bars previous, you can see in 24 Q1 that the bars are sort of twice as high as the dots. And again in Q2, the bars are about twice as high as the dots, but at a greater scale. And then in Q3, quite vivid difference there between the expectation, which is those tall bars and in the penultimate set of bars, and the dots, even where one dot ends up in negativity. Now in Q4, we have a more mixed situation where output actually exceeded expectations, and that's what we saw on that graph. That sort of call it a Christmas boost. We saw similar in Q3, where it pipped there, but we didn't see the commensurate demand to give us confidence. But actually, orders came in underneath those expectations. But what we're likely to see next quarter is well, if the sector doesn't move into contractionary territory, which we don't necessarily think it will, is a far more on point expectation being delivered, and the end of this rather high, very, very high consecutive expectations quarter on quarter. So if you have the next slide, please. Now, price setting behavior. Now, this is very interesting, and of course, it's very pertinent in a high base rate environment. Now, what you're looking at here is what the bars don't represent input prices, as they can often be confused as. What these represent is price setting behavior. So, for lack of a better word, factory gate pricing decisions. And the bars, like the other metrics, suggest the proportion of industry that are suggesting they're raising or decreasing their prices quarter on quarter with regards to their UK prices and their export prices. Now, I'll get to the lines in a moment. Now, looking at this, you can see that obviously we've had the big peak in 2022, and it's come along down from that. It was in Q1 of this year that you can just see in between where it says 24 Q2 and 23 Q4. It's not actually directly, the legend isn't visible there, but you can see it peaked a bit at the start of the year. And that had us quite nervous. It came off that downward trajectory, and this was particularly important because that's just the price setting behavior was starting to climb, despite the wider business environment not suggesting for any classical reasons that it should. We didn't have a massive boom in demand at the time. We still had a very high base rate. It hadn't started easing yet. So, there was no suggestion that, well, suddenly the activity is coming back, so inflation's coming back in. And so that was, worrying sort of unchecked inflation. Of course, at the time, there was a little growth. So it's return to that horrible word that, us economists all love to hate, which is stagflation. Now, looking at the bar just to the left of the green box bar, we see we're pretty much level to what we saw in 24 Q3. Interestingly, it's not flat. This is, it's still suggesting quarter on quarter the sector are raising their prices. It's just the rate of growth of, the proportion is slowing. Now, in the green box bar, this is what I mean about pinch assaulting. Now, this is slightly different to the metrics where, there's very high expectations for performance, because I suppose that this bar and this metric are slightly less related to direct, output and, orders and that sort of thing. So it could be overestimated, but nevertheless, let's take it at face value for a moment. And that suggests that, the sector's going to see a climbing in price setting behavior next quarter, which is something to really watch out for. Coincidentally, we'll now talk about the lines, which represent UK and export margins respectively. The sector suggests that, margins are just sort of, teetering on the flat mark as of this quarter. But the sector suggests that with a raise in prices next quarter, that'll effectively allow more breathing room for those margins to grow back into positivity, which is an interesting point. But of course, the victim of that, if that is to occur, victim's probably one word, but the head scratching will occur, in the MPC at the bank as it looks as this supply side inflation starts to build itself back into economy, if it goes that way. Which would mean a much slower eventual, lowering of the path we're now on to lower those base rates. So if I can have the next slide, please. Now, confidence, I think really the main course here, and quite a simple graph, quite easy to understand. I hope what you're looking at here is business performance, which is the top line, the deep red line. That represents the aggregation of the confidence of UK manufacturers in their own business. The orange line represents that same view, but in manufacturers' confidence in the wider UK economy. Now, what we're seeing here is at the very, very tail end there, you can see it dip off. Now, why is this, important? Well, you can sort of tell for the past 6 quarters or so, you can see confidence been extremely robust and extremely flat and flat and growing steadily. And has been completely unfussed really about any of the performance, confidence metric has been unfussed by any of the performance variation that we've seen in other metrics over the past, year and a half. So that's interesting. So perhaps, we've been getting into the reads a bit too much about, orders are down and the output's up, because the sector, as per the high level confidence, hasn't changed. This has also perhaps been driving, as I mentioned in a couple of slides ago, that serious overestimation in how performance would turn out to be in each successive quarter. But now we see an end to that consistent run, and we see a downturn. Now, it's really important to note that this graph effectively above, if you look at the left-hand side, above 5 means positivity, below 5 means negativity. So even though there is a downturn, it still remains in positivity. So it's not so scary that let's say, well, the sector's turned wildly negative. It is, however, important when we combine these two factors of the end of the overestimation of performance and the first divot in confidence that we've seen for the past year and a half. So, an important, sign there. Next slide, please. Now, the final metrics, employment and investment. Now, the red bars representing employment. Now, a little caveat for the green box bar here that we find through this work, and that's the future 3-month expectation for employment. What we find the sector tends to respond to this, they respond to it in the nature of their, to illustrate the labor shortage, and less so perhaps in the true sense of the metric of suggesting that, well, next quarter we're going to employ, we're going to increase employment, rapidly by 2025 Q1. So really what this illustrates, and it's correlates to, and it historically has, correlates to the severity of the vacancy rate, which, those of you that have tuned into this before know I do like to bang on about, because I think it's a very interesting yardstick and a rough yardstick, but a yardstick nevertheless, of, how much clamoring there is for labor in our sector. So currently, well, I'll start with previously, pre-COVID, the vacancy rate within the sector was 1.8 to 2 jobs vacant per every 100 employed. So you can say about 1.82%. Now, in about 2022, the early 2022, that peaked at 4 or just over 4 jobs vacant per every 100 employed. So, in effect, if we're using the vacancy rate to proxy for that demand, the labor market was twice as hot and twice as clamoring for manufacturing labor as the long run average. Now, in 24, the end of 2024, and throughout the year, really, that figure's been steadily coming down for the past 2 years. And now actually we're getting quite close to that long run pre-COVID average. It's at about 2.3, 2.4 jobs vacant per every 100 employed. And as I mentioned, the long run average is only 1.82. So it's getting quite close to them. So what does this tell us? This suggests that the severity of the labor shortage is easing, but it's really important not to confuse, and it's a bit semantic-y at this point, but the labor shortage and the skill shortage. And if I'm going to, simplify it in simple terms, effectively with the labor shortage, I'm talking about BODs. And if I'm talking about skill shortage, I'm talking about a specific need for specific skills. So let's say, high-level welders of a certain caliber, that sort of thing. And so, one of those problems is a bit more evergreen, has been pervasive for a very long time in our sector, whereas the severity of the labor shortage has ebbed and flowed, and we're currently on a down, on an ebb, effectively. At least the data would suggest that. On investment intentions, which is that orange line. Now, I mentioned that you might say to me, James, well, I can see that orange line. It's a rolling 12-month average. So what I mean by that is that although we elicit the data from the sector every quarter, it's about their future 12-month intention to try and take away some of the variability. But it looks consistent and positive. So you might think, well, why is that a problem? And the thing is that you can see it's been for about 2 years that consistent and that positive. The challenges in that period, we've had a lot of events, domestic events, geopolitical events that have supposed to release that capital. That, well, and case in point to sort of illustrate, make it a bit clearer of what I'm going on about. We've had, the imposition of the new government, which, was long said, well, political uncertainty, we knew political uncertainty was making firms hold back some capex. So we thought, well, we have that now. Of course, in this period as well, we've had the imposition of some of the strongest pro-business investment policies that we've seen in living memory, and that's in the case of full expensing, in the permanency of annual investment allowances, So all these things have happened, so you'd expect them to really move the needle, except they haven't. It stayed in a holding pattern. We've also, perhaps one of the strongest fundamental factors to start, nudging capex along, is we've had a signal from the Bank of England that we've started the downswing from the peak of the base rate at, I think, 5.25 or whatever it was, and we're slowly coming down, the speed of which is unknown, and of course the percentage hasn't changed that much, but it's the signal that we're now on the downslope. The cost of capital is decreasing, and that should normally offer some confidence to investment decision makers to make those investments, but it hasn't come through. So that's an interesting point. We can now really quite surmise that the sector's capex decisions are fundamentally governed by economic headwinds. And even though we've had really great policies come in, the sector isn't using them to a significant enough degree in order to move that needle through the orange line. So could I have the next slide, please? This is simply a visualization of those first forecasts I showed you at the very start, and we'll see them in a slide as well. Effectively, 2024 ended up the year flat. It is the lowest figure of the year of the revisions we've done. So I'm talking about the red bar in the middle there. It's the lowest figure of the year, but it's not that negative because it's been hovering about 0.4, 0.2, 0.5 all year. So these aren't great figures, but it's not a sudden massive downgrade despite it having gone to minus 0.2. 2025 slightly more important, that there's not a huge amount of growth expectation in 2025 either, which I think is the more important story here when it comes to the forecast. I'm going to have the next and final slide, please. You'll be relieved here. So I think I've talked about a lot here, and I normally say, well, 3 things to take away. I think there's really one thing to take away here, just one this time. If I really want to focus the mind on something, it is the implication for this confidence dip. And now I wish I could be an oracle and share with you exactly what's going to happen next, but I think it'll be associated with this. And I can't tell you exactly what is going to happen with regards to performance, because it's the first time we've seen that combination. Something's definitely happened. Very confident about that, because we have the combination of the core confidence metric taking a dive across both UK economy confidence and business confidence, but also that is backed up with the evidence that we see in the individual metrics, where the future expectation, as I detailed at length, the future expectation quarter on quarter for output orders, whatever it might be, has been so high and so overestimated by the sector quarter on quarter for the last year and a half, that finally it's sobered up. So the combination of these things suggests a sudden cooling in expectation from the sector, and how that meets out in Q1 25 will be particularly interesting. So I'll stop there and hand you back to Richard.
Thanks, James. Less Santa, more Grinch, I'm thinking. It's yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you what you think next year's gonna hold for us. I think you've probably answered that question already in terms of your sort of final message there. I think the other thing is, and we'll probably come onto it in the panel discussion, is around the impact of the budget, which is pretty significant, especially for the manufacturing sector. I think it was you guys who sort of the simple maths tells you that in terms of per employee, it's going to put about £1,000 per employee onto people's cost without any added value whatsoever. So that's kind of the reality of it. It's it feels like that, yeah, when April kicks in, it won't just be sort of a headache. It's be probably slightly more of a hangover, I think, in terms of people's feeling off the back of it. Just one question for you, James, before I let you go. And thank you very much for your input over this year. Just in terms of any other key messages that you want to put out there for manufacturers for 2025, either opportunities or things to be wary of. What would other takeaways be for you, James?
You're right, and it's probably remiss of me not to mention, the impact of the budget. I avoided it, and to be frank with, our attendees in the room, is that the research window clipped the budget. And so the amount of sentiment captured by the budget, it did fall within the window, but how much so that, that meted out in manufacturers' minds as they took part in the field work, is yet to be seen. So it's certain that there's going to be some influence, and no doubt that could be some of where the confidence dip's coming from the the NICS changes anecdotally is first front and foremost in most of our members' minds, the manufacturers we engage with. It's a real headache with that coming in. Now, with regards to what the sector is going to be looking at, if that's a question in next year, I think when you have that NICS change, and you combine it with the Employment Rights Bill, otherwise known as Make Work Pay or the New Deal for Working People, whatever nomenclature you prefer. But effectively, that's going to be a real, quite significant change in labor and hiring policy, and the biggest change that the sector will have seen for quite some time. And so when you have the impact of NICs coming straight in at the start of the tax year next year, and then also 2026, the start of 26 is when the Employment Rights Bill comes in and grows its teeth. You'll have those 7 months where there will be no delaying. You have to get your house in order and your ducks in a row, deciding on how you want your labor structure within your company to look like before that more flexibility is potentially taken away from your business when the chocks drop in 2026.
Yeah, I think there's that, and I think the sentiment around investment as well is the other bit that probably needs thinking about. I mean, if you're a company, right? I mean, obviously the budget throughout hits in terms of NICs, quite significant ones. At the same time, it's kind of dangling the carrot of some sort of industrial strategy, and obviously that's green paper at the moment, and I think they're still seeking input into that between now and the new year as well. So if you haven't anyone on this call who hasn't contributed to that, please do. But I think that other piece around, look, if you're going to put the cost of a person up, then you've either got to have a higher value output from that individual, or you need to start thinking about how you can bring in investment to sort of drive automation, etc., to support profitability, and that requires a decent runway and understanding for it, and also probably some tax benefits to it as well. Otherwise, it's going to be an interesting world, especially as we will have a new US president next year with a slightly different view on international trade. James, thank you so much for your input today. We'll bring you back on for the Q&A at the end of the session, but thanks very much. If you do have any questions for James in the meantime, please, as I said, do put it into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and James will be happy to pick those up at the end of the webinar today. So we'll move over to a panel discussion. So as I said at the beginning, what we're going to be doing is talking about supply chains, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have Matthew Clark, who's our Customs and Excise and International Trade Services. Now there's a mouthful. Joining us. Matthew, thank you very much indeed. And Fraser Paget also joining us, who's our head of supply chain and logistics as well from BDO. I think we sort of said at the beginning of this, there's all kinds of changes in terms of trade flows at the moment. Some of that is driven by changes in supply chain reliability and predictability and cost as well, which I'm sure we'll be picking up on. And also getting a better understanding of what the tax implications of some of the things that are going on at the moment as well. And the importance of getting your reporting right into HMRC is becoming a particularly, sensitive subject, which we'll pick up on as well as we go through. So I have to apologise at this point. I do not have my Christmas jumper on, whereas Fraser and Matthew are doing the right festive thing. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for your contribution and sartorial elegance this afternoon. So, gents, can I kick off? Matthew, I'll kick off with you. I mean, obviously, budget's thrown some things out. There are some other implications in terms of what HMRC are up to at the moment as well. Clearly, Rachel Reeves is looking to sort of pull a few more pound notes into the coffers at the moment, and part of that obviously surrounds understanding trading activity and kind of the excise elements of that. I mean, if you were looking back over the last 12 months, Matthew, and thinking about manufacturing clients, what are the sort of things that either you've seen over the last 12 months, and also what are the things that probably people need to start thinking about if they haven't already for 2025 as well?
Thanks, Richard. I think certainly in the last 12 months, we've seen what I would say is a post-Brexit light touch from HMRC start to diminish. And what they're actually doing now is going out to businesses and checking the reasons why they aren't paying the standard amount of customs duty and import VAT on goods that are imported into the UK. So the focus has very much been around the audit of special procedures. So that could be customs warehousing, for example, or inward processing. So inward processing is a relief that the use of it has quadrupled since Brexit. So that's where you import raw materials or parts, you make a product in the UK, and then you ship it overseas again to an overseas customer, and you don't pay any customs duty or import VAT on the goods and raw materials that you bring into your manufacturing process. But everything with these types of reliefs is very much around, is your accounting system fit for purpose? Is it maintaining the data that you need to meet the requirements for that particular relief? And can you illustrate that and show HMRC when they request it, if they do an audit or an investigation? So there's an awful lot of that at the moment. So I would say for those that are attending today, if you operate a special procedure such as customs warehousing, inward processing, temporary admission, return goods relief, anything like that, just make sure your compliance is absolutely perfect and you're dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And if not, get in touch for some advice, because it is definitely a topic that is heating up. I think the other two topics, Richard, are one is the use of preferential origin. So we've got a free trade agreement with the EU. We have since Brexit. Anything that is truly made or sourced within the EU and meets the EU rules of origin can come into the UK free of duty, and vice versa. Same for the things that we make in the UK and we send into the EU. But a lot of businesses are just presuming, I will use that word, that the origin is correct and the goods they're getting from the EU are EU origin, and that is how they are declaring them to HMRC. But they're not actually checking with the suppliers. Are they actually made in the EU? Is this where the goods come from? So I've had a couple of manufacturers that have been hit this year because they didn't know better, because they'd not asked their suppliers where this stuff came from, and therefore HMRC have come in and said, not certain this stuff is made in Europe. Can you go and check with your suppliers? They did, and they've had to go back to HMRC and say, yeah, actually, it wasn't made in the EU. We just bought it from a supplier there, and they've been hit for quite a lot of duty retrospectively. So if you're going to claim preferential origin from any country, make sure that the goods meet the rules, and you're not just claiming it because the goods are dispatched from that country to the UK. That's the biggest mistake that I'm seeing them making in that field. And then the last one is just a note of caution on how to value your goods if you're buying them from related parties. We have seen a lot of uptick with our transfer pricing colleagues, Richard, where we've seen a joint approach from HMRC on customs and transfer pricing, where they're questioning the customs value of the imported goods and how up to date that transfer pricing methodology is. And they're especially looking for tricky things like post-importation transfer pricing, true-up adjustments, royalties and license fees. I think that's three key areas that I'd watch out for that I've seen increasingly become audited in the last 12 months.
Richard's
I
on
think
I'm mute, so I'm going to ask a question.
Go on,
What does that?
Fraser.
What's the so what if I'm a manufacturer and I get that wrong? You say they're increasingly active. What do? Do they knock up? Does Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith rock up, or does?
I mean, they do to a certain extent, Fraser. HMRC have got more powers of entry and seizure than the police. So if they
So I need to get it right.
yeah, if they're truly unsure about your goods, and they can actually kind of seize them on your premises and leave them there until they've investigated the issue that is at hand, and that happens in customs bonded warehouses quite often. Luckily enough, we tend not to see a huge amount of penalties within the customs world. So what we do see is an assessment and a willingness to raise assessments for underpaid tax on customs duty and import VAT, but the penalties tend to be quite small. It is a different game for excise duty though. So for people that deal in oil, alcohol and tobacco, that can be very punitive if you get it wrong. So you can typically see penalty rates of anywhere between 10 and 50% if you've not got your due diligence in place in relation to that tax type. So, I mean, it's just worthwhile getting it right. And I know we would say that as advisors, but it means you can just get on with your business and there's no disruption in the event HMRC do come a calling.
Yeah, it sounds like they've tooled up quite a lot over the last 12 months.
Been a lot of hires. They've
yeah.
increased their audit officers, and there's a lot of them being trained at the moment, which means they are going to be deployed into the market 2025. So we are expecting more officers and more challenges simply because they have more resources, Richard.
Yeah, and it's always easier to get your ducks in a row in advance rather than playing catch up, because
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's where it gets really, one, it gets really expensive in terms of time spent, but also I suspect that if you're HMRC and you pull on a thread and it starts to unravel, then once they found something, they don't let go of stuff either. So yeah.
Yeah, I had an automotive parts supplier that was bringing something in. They did something to it and then supplied it to an automotive OEM, a brand owner in the UK. And it wasn't the fact that they were going to pay a bit more duty on it. It was the fact that HMRC wouldn't let them move the goods on. So they then defaulted on their supply contract to the automotive OEM, which was very punitive under their contract terms and hurt them a lot more than any assessment that HMRC would give them. So it's your ability to keep your trade going. That's often what happens in my world. It's not necessarily the tax that becomes the biggest headache.
Yeah. And on that, I mean, Fraser, sort of bringing you in, obviously, that kind of change from just in time to almost more just in case, which was kind of where we ended up with during COVID. And it's still, I guess, at that end of the balance compared to just in time. But good to get your views on how supply chains have changed either over the last 12 months or post COVID as well, and where you think we're going more broadly as well. Would be great.
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors at play. There's the whole localization. Can I source my goods locally, or am I getting them abroad? And we are seeing a massive swing in manufacturing to say, I would actually pay a bit more. We did some, it was a previous manufacturing survey. But yeah, 54% of said they're influenced by geopolitical, and that's driving that localization. 53% said they'd pay more if I could get it from a local source, and that negates some of the issues. Okay, you've still got the EU, but that negates your China issues and your Far East. And then I think there's the shipping issues as it's coming across. That's still a factor. How much am I paying for freight? How stable are my routes? Because that's the million-dollar question at the moment. How much am I going to pay? And people are looking at inventory, just in case, just in time. I think manufacturing struggles with just in case because it's been ingrained since, well, before I was born, but Japanese manufacturing had that lean just in case technology, Kaizen and Six Sigma, and they just can't get out of that. You've seen Aston Martin recently issue a profit warning. That's because of the China demand for their vehicles and their supply chain. They just can't get enough parts. And even if you crash it, if you're lucky enough to have an Aston Martin and you crash it, you can't actually get it repaired at the moment because Aston Martin are keeping all the components to build the production, to keep the production line going. So, yeah. So I think there's lots of things going on within supply chains to say there is no normal. You said something earlier, you said predictability. There is no predictability anymore. And I think businesses just have to plan for that and scenario test all the way through the supply chain from onboarding suppliers, due diligence. So again, I think, look, the world is unstable. Look what's happened in Syria the last few weeks. No one would have predicted that. So you've got south of the Suez Canal now and the north of the Suez Canal with geopolitical disruption. So I think it's a very difficult one to answer, is just in time to just in case. I think it has an effect on cash flow. Your bean counters will know that more than me. Where do I invest that cash, especially with the budget, national insurance contributions, all that stuff is making cash. You've got to make it work hard. So I don't know if I've actually answered the question, Richard. All I've done is said it's a very unpredictable world, whereas manufacturing wants a predictable world, don't we?
Thanks, Fraser. Thanks for muddying that even more. I really appreciate that.
That's okay.
On that kind of looking forwards bit, Matthew, I'll bring you back in here, but it's probably something for all of us to mull around. Is obviously we will have a change in administration in the US. Obviously, the Trump ticket, a lot of that was driven by trade, international trade, and changes to that in terms of policy. Which I think he has the right to pretty much change stuff at will, which is rather interesting and leads to even more unpredictability. I mean, it'd be useful to get your thoughts on what the Trump administration might do. I suspect there's a fair bit of scaremongering in terms of negotiating position coming out, but it'd be useful to get your views on that as to where this might end up. I also suspect that will probably, it'll probably be unintended consequences more than anything that might hit us,
Yeah.
based on, Canada, Mexico and China. But I mean, good to get your thoughts.
It's an interesting one. I mean, he is going to make America great again. That is his slogan, isn't it? And one of his main drivers to do that is to try and reinvigorate the manufacturing industry in the US. He wants to bring all these firms that moved out to the US to manufacture, some of them, into Canada, a lot went into Mexico to lower their costs and keep their price points down. He wants them to come back. That's his primary objective in this, increasing jobs in the US, increasing the economy. And one of the ways that he's going to do that is he's saying, well, okay, I can look at the tariffs that I charge on goods from these countries coming into the US, and I can increase those. I can make it more expensive for businesses that do manufacture in countries close to us to import those goods into the US, and I will encourage them to move their manufacturing back in again. And look, Fraser knows there's a whole load of different factors at play in moving manufacturing plants and supply chains. It's very, very difficult. It takes a long time. But he's looking for something that will have an impact over years. But in terms of international trade, what he can do is he can bring in tariffs and change those fairly quickly. So there's a multitude of different types of tariffs that he is able to bring in. Now, his inauguration, Richard, I think is for the 20th of January. He's already pledged in his, pre-election speeches and continued to do so since, that he is going to increase the rates for Canada and Mexico. And they're covered under a free trade agreement at the moment. So that kind of tears up this free trade agreement and kind of, just says, I'm creating a new playing field for everyone to deal with. You've already had the Canadian government come back and go, hang about, we don't like this. This is what we're going to do in response. So this is where people might have seen in the press global trade wars in the past. And this is where you get two different countries starting to put retaliatory measures on each other when someone does something that they think is unreasonable. So I think what we can expect from any Trump tariffs that go in, and some of them could come in as early as this month, where he's saying, 10, 25% additional on Mexican and Canadian goods, you could see an immediate bounce back on products from the US coming into those territories. Of course, one of the biggest supply chains that he doesn't like is anything coming from China into the US. He thinks China floods the US with really cheap products, but US people are now reliant on the price point of those products for a lot of their staple products that they buy on a weekly, monthly basis. He doesn't like that. And he's talked about, 60% tariff increases on goods coming from China into the US. And that's interesting because one, it's very high. Two, it completely alters the price point. We've got a manufacturer that sells products into the US that gets some of its products from China. Three of them will become non-profitable, Richard, if 60% tariffs hit them. So there is literally no point in them selling those three lines into the US market, which is three of their top 10 lines, if they continue to get them manufactured in China. So that is a huge headache that Fraser and I are helping them with at the moment, to look at viable alternatives and how they can move manufacture if this comes to pass. And to be honest, we kind of believe it will. There's a lot of bipartisan support for President-elect Trump from both sides in Congress to pass measures against China. So I do think he will get them through. They might take a little bit longer than the measures that he brings in against Mexico and Canada, but I do think they could come in the next 6 to 9 months. So we can all expect retaliatory measures. He's also mentioned in passing the EU. And I think what would be very interesting for the UK is, where do we sit in between that relationship? Does the UK kind of align itself more with the EU because they are our primary trading partner, or do we align ourselves more with the US? I don't know which way that will go, but that is a very political situation for the current government to skate through. And it could go wrong, because at the moment he kind of sees the UK as a bit of an ally because we've left the EU, but I don't know whether we would take the EU side in an argument or not. People might remember a couple of years ago, 2 tariffs that we put on response to the US actions was We increased the tax on Harley Davidsons and we increased the tax on bourbon. Two things that are very close to my heart, Richard, that I was not very happy about when they did that. But it's just an idea, like we'll pick US things coming into the EU and the UK and go, they're products that are important to you. We will increase the tax on them. And this is the tit for tat kind of global trade wars that I think could kick off again in 2025 because of the measures that he's promising to bring in.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight into your life, Matthew.
Yeah, there you go. Two
Thanks,
important things.
I think it's one of those things where that they're kind of you're trying to. The question is that political positioning, right? Because you're just going after big brand emotive names, right? So if Donald, the Trump administration goes after whiskey, which is a massive industry for Scotland, versus I don't know 12,000 Harley Davidson motorbikes, it's slightly different dynamics associated with that. Thanks, Matthew. Fraser, just be useful to get your thoughts on the future of trade globally as Mr. Trump comes to power.
Yeah, I think the UK to America is well, we export a huge amount, but it's a lot of services, so it's not as bad as if it was in with Europe. So I think the manufacturing, we export a lot more to Europe than we do to America. So that's just because of the distances involved and the cost involved and being competitive. So I think from that perspective, I don't think it will hit the UK as much. I think what the UK is, so that international trade, it's more businesses that are China-based that are really coming to us and going, what do we do? Help. There's a lot that are based in the Middle East who are worried about what he's going to do. So again, we're seeing a big uptick in queries coming from those regions to say, I'm importing into America, what do I do? I don't think for the UK it's as bad as, well, hopefully that it could be. So I think from a UK point of view, we're okay. And just going back to another area of what are we looking at and what are the hot topics is that automation and that struggle for staff. We've seen a huge increase in the wholesale and manufacturing. Just every process, can I automate it? So, if there was a top tip for 2025, it would be look at those automation producers and their capacity and capability. I'll be getting my orders in now, because if you've got a project that you want to land in 2025 or early 26, you need to get your orders in now. That's the one area that is really booming. A lot of them are EU based. There's some very, very good ones in the UK as well. But that area is really looking at, and that's partly because of a skill shortage, as James was alluding to, and partly because of the cost, as you said earlier, Richard. You've got to get your pound of flesh, haven't you? You've got to make the most of that individual employee. So that's every process for CAM is being automated, and investing in systems to make those. I think it was 51.2% of manufacturers are going to invest in their technology. And this is an AI. I'm not going down an AI. This is just their core ERP systems, manufacturing systems, supply chain systems to improve that productivity level.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because obviously, like you say, a lot of this sits around working capital as well and just cash for businesses. You're going to get a bit of a kick in April, bit of a kicking if you've got a big staff headcount. At the same time, there's probably additional uncertainty as to where we'll end up with trading relationships. I think it was interesting from James's the latest details around that. Exports was actually stronger than domestic demand. So that export number is critically important for UK manufacturers. So
Yeah.
if you've got increased costs, you've got maybe additional frictional or export costs associated with shipping stuff out. And you're kind of saying, look, actually the way out of this is to start investing in automation of some description and trying to do that. Then the question is there going to be something from government or elsewhere that will help actually sort of allow people to do that in a maybe potentially a tax efficient way? Otherwise, that you've only got a pound in your pocket. The question is where do you put it, and how quickly you're going to be able to turn that pound into £2. That's kind of the challenge, isn't it?
Because a lot of what is happening globally is a huge multinationals, and the UK manufacturing base is predominantly quite small businesses, but there's just lots and lots of them, which is great for the UK and great for our relationships and exporting manufactured goods to the EU. So I think you can go down the rabbit hole of what's Trump going to do, but I think what's important to the UK and UK manufacturing is those import-export costs, the shipping costs, and trying to get as automated and as tech savvy as possible. That would, that would be my strategy if I was in one of those.
I think it's a really good point, Fraser. And we haven't kind of spoken today about the ESG agenda, have we? But if you think about a lot of the new reporting requirements that are coming in, that we know that are coming down the line for the manufacturing industry, you've got the carbon border adjustment model reporting that came in October 23 in the EU. And initially we thought, well, that kind of won't affect us if you don't import into the EU. It's the importer that has the reporting requirement. But what we've been helping, UK manufacturers is they've got to provide all that carbon data to their EU customer, so the EU customer can do their reporting to the relevant authority. And again, Fraser, exactly to your point, have you got the systems to calculate that? Have you got the systems to just capture it so you can report it to your customers? We've got deforestation regs coming in Europe, which has got another thing for anything that comes out of countries where they think forests are being cut down to make products. We've got UK CBAM coming in 2027. All those environmental taxes are requiring manufacturers to do more and more reporting, and you've got to have the data and the systems to do it. And it might not be right now that they're affected, but I think you're right. I think, there's got to be an awful lot of investment over systems in the next 5 years to cope with a lot of things that are coming down the line. And Richard, to your point, I still think post-Brexit, trying to put my Christmas happy hat on, there are still an awful lot of businesses that are not terribly efficient in terms of their supply chain, how they do their declarations. They're not making the most out of customs duty reliefs in the UK. So I'm still constantly surprised when I speak to quite big manufacturers and I say, you're unnecessarily paying duty. We can save you this if you use this relief. And sometimes it can be really big numbers. So, I would definitely err on the side of review what you're doing, make sure whether you can optimize your tax or not, and get professional advice, whether it's us or someone else, because there's definitely ways to cut costs from an international trade perspective. And I don't think everyone is utilizing all the reliefs available to them from HMRC.
Yeah, and on my onboarding, it's again in the last quarter, 78.8% do financial due diligence. So they're doing a D&B check, Smart Search, Navex, but only 50.2% are doing any ESG at all. And if you want to get funding off private equity banks, that's going to become more and more important. So again, I think the manufacturing sector is going to have to embed that in when they onboard a new supplier, and they need to increase the supplier base to build resilience, but then continue to monitor them because of the M&A activity that's going on especially in the digital world and the supply chain world, with the big American companies coming over and sweeping up. They want that global supply chain, so I think they need to embed that in their processes.
Yeah, so which kind of underlines, you're absolutely right, Fraser, that there will be an additional onus in terms of checks and balances on the supply chain to provide one sort of assurance of supply, but also meeting reporting requirements. Clearly, there's a cost associated with doing that as well, right? So making sure that's as smooth and as slick as you possibly can make it, especially if it's something that you haven't done before, requires a bit of thinking, right? To make sure that you're embedding something that's actually scalable, rather than, blimey, we need to start complying with something. We're going to do a few one-offs to make sure that we sort of meet whatever our customers are looking for. That's all well and good when there's 2 or 3 of them, but when there's 2,000 or 3,000 of them, it's a slightly different situation, right?
It is, and that's been driven by customer behaviour and private equity and banks as well. If they want to invest in a business, they want to know that your supplier base is scope-free compliance.
Right.
And absolutely, from our perspective, we've just seen a law passed in the EU which followed the US practice of, is it an ethical supply chain? Are you buying from a supplier that has ethical practices in the country where they manufacture, if you're buying raw materials and parts for them for manufacture in the UK? So the EU's followed the US to pass legislation on that to say we will completely prohibit and investigate any countries or any businesses where we think this is not the case, and just stop their goods from coming into our country. The UK is slightly behind the curve on that, Richard, but that again goes through to the ethical and the sustainability of supply chains under ESG. It will come in sooner or later. So to Fraser's point, starting to ask those questions around what are the working conditions, where do you get your parts, your materials from, all those types of things. What is the carbon footprint of your manufacturing process? This is just going to become the norm in the future. Businesses are going to have to get all this information from their suppliers and make sure that they're happy to procure from these overseas businesses, lest they get stopped from importing the goods or get hit with quite big taxes when they import them into the UK or wherever their manufacturing location is.
Yeah. Oh, all cheery stuff then,
Yeah,
gentlemen.
it used
Yeah,
to be
I mean,
how
so-
much did it cost and how soon can I get it? Now there's about 400 questions you have to
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, exactly. And again, the question is, can I make a profit? Can I turn a profit? And if the answer is yes, how do I make things as efficient as I possibly can and make sure I generate cash from the business? Gentlemen, thank you very much. One last question for each one of you. Matthew, I'll come to you first. So if I was looking at 2025 through the Matthew Clark lens, what would be the one thing that I'd need to think about from a customs, excise, and tax perspective?
I would say to review your current compliance from two aspects. One would be make sure there's no skeletons in the closet, because we are seeing increased audit activity from HMRC. So please don't get caught out and get caught unawares. And the other side is review what you're doing for potential optimization, Richard. There's still an awful lot that companies can do from a saving perspective to lower their costs. And that could be from a tax perspective, the cost of your brokerage or your freight. From Fraser's perspective, looking at your supply chains, are they the most efficient? Have you got things in the right place? What are your stock holdings? All those kind of things come together to just improve your margins in your business. So I'd look at it from those two perspectives within the next 12 months.
Thanks, Matthew. Same question for you, Fraser.
Oh, it's never that simple in my world. I'll be looking at my people. Have I got enough of them? And are they trained correctly? And can I keep them? I'll be looking at my automation. How can I make their lives easier, more productive? And have they got the right systems and processes to enable that? Whenever you go into a business, it's what people have I got, what processes have I got, and what technology enables those people to be as productive as possible.
Oh,
Sorry, it's a stock answer, Richard.
The
Sorry.
three magic buckets of an operating model, Fraser.
Yeah.
People, process, systems. Got to love it. Big fan of that. Gents, thank you very much. We've got 2 minutes left. I don't know if we can squeeze in a cheeky question at all, Bal. James, hopefully you're still with us. Fantastic. We probably got enough time for a couple of questions, Bal, if you want to sort of sift through what we've got.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, James, we've had one question for yourself. With subsidies and tax breaks coming in at the end, coming to an end, and growth of the EV market slowing, where will the automotive market go next?
It's a good question, and I think it relates to what was really just being discussed there as well. Because of course one of the major challenges, independent of, and I think as the question asker is suggesting, consumer demand in the EV market is not particularly strong. I think a lot of that is being driven by the residual value of EVs, and that that really weighing on consumer purchasing decisions. But obviously the other challenge from a completely different side of the field is the relative cost of Chinese EVs in the UK market, which are exploding, of course, exploding in relative popularity, despite the overall popularity of EVs decreasing, just really on the ability of the marginal cost of production being much cheaper, coming from the East, which makes the challenge for domestic EV manufacturers even greater. Of course, I don't think there'll be a strong, now again, this is a little bit crystal balling, but I would be surprised if there was a strong reversal from companies, our domestic car makers, because of the amount of sunk cost, huge amounts of sunk cost in effectively transitioning supply chains, reskilling employees, whole factory adaptations, and even creation of new factories. So that'll hang around, and the sector will commit to that in the longer term. It basically can't afford to really reverse from that. Excuse me. I think what we will see, and what we've continued to see is where possible. We've already had the hint. Was it last year towards the end of Sunak's premiership? You know, the extension of the net zero vehicle sale thing. Now it's not a million miles away or unconceivable that might get maybe pushed again, particularly if the EU pushes that out. I think we're likely to follow that, and of course, the most recent push out of that net zero goal for for internal combustion vehicles sort of brought us in line with the EU. So that's a hint there. You know, we were 5 years earlier. We've seen domestic car makers, not grandfather or retire their combustion engine lines as fast as was expected. I won't name names, but it's common across all. The same is seen in German car manufacturers as well. Going back on announcements that, let's say this year, or where quite a few vehicle manufacturers were 2023 or 2024 would be the last combustion engines that would roll off their production line, and that's not going to be the case anymore. So the sector will sort of continue to do dual, that they won't roll back on their commitment and the investments that they've made into EV production, but they're unlikely to switch off combustion engine production vehicles as fast as perhaps they indicated in the previous 3 years.